Okay, good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1440. So let me sum up what we learned, and then we shall continue. So as we discussed yesterday, it's a little dense and complex, but I'll try to break it down. So the general theme is this. We're talking about the concept of Yichud, Kudshabricha, and Shechina, which is a classic expression that we say every morning in the prayer. Essentially means the unification of two dimensions of the divine. Kudshabricha referring to the divine that's removed from the word Kodesh. In Hebrew, Kodesh, holy, means Havdalah, removed, like transcendent and beyond. And Shechina is manifestation, is how the divine manifests. Like when we say the Mishkan, why is it called Mishkan? Sanctuary. Because Mishkan from the word Shechina means it's resting and dwelling there. So when you feel the divine within yourself, in your heart and soul, that's a level of Shechina. When you sense the divine beyond you, above your head, so to speak, or beyond you, sense of awe is a transcendent. But ultimately, what Judaism teaches is the unification of these two levels. So what we've been learning since the top of page 1434 is we've been learning where are these two levels called Kudshabricha and Shechina. And to sum up, he's literally gone through, he said, in the words of the Alter Rebbe, he said that Yedua, that is Kudshabricha v'Shechina adrei ma'mailas. It goes up through all the levels, it ripples through all the levels of the cosmic order. And to be specific, number one is it's Zah and Malchus, essentially the Midas and Malchus of Atzilus. Just summing it up. Chachma and Bina is also Kudshabricha and Shechina, all relative to each other. Keser and Chachma, within Keser itself, within desire, Rotzen, the level of Arich, the Malchus of Arich and the emotions of Arich, or the core emotions, it's Atik and Arich. There is the Malchus of Ak and the core of Ak, Adam Kadman. In Ak itself, it's outer dimension of Ak and inner dimension. And then what the last piece we've learned is as the Kav is the Shechina, because the Kav, which is the narrow line of the transmission, basically what we call it like a laser beam divine manifestation into existence, because using the classic example, the teacher is a brilliant teacher, and the student would not have any place if the teacher's infinite brilliance was just shining forth. So the teacher employs what we call a tzimtzum, a concealment to leave space for another consciousness, for independent consciousness. The same thing with the divine. As the Arizal puts it, Eir Ein Sof filled all the expanse of all of reality. That was the only sole exclusive reality. It was a seamless divine consciousness, but that would not leave room for existence. So essentially, God employs a tzimtzum. Tzimtzum literally means to conceal, to contract, to recede. So the energy recedes and allows for space. That's called the cholol l'makom panei, an empty space. Essentially like the space that a teacher leaves for a student or a parent for a child. Every type of relationship is going to always leave space for another. And then space is not enough. Then you want to have a stream of consciousness. And the kav is a thin line. Literally, kav means line. Chut is thread. A thin line enters into this so-called black hole. And that is called the kav. This kav will be, think of it like the paintbrush of an artist, measured and commensurate, will shape and define the structure of existence. Had there been no tzimtzum, no concealment, everything would just be completely infinite, completely seamless, completely unstructured, no definitions, no hierarchy. The kav allows for so-called the channeling of that infinite energy into some form of finite structure. So he says that's the primary level of Shechina, because the idea of Shechina is to bring it into manifestation. So where better is that being expressed than in the kav? That's what we learned at the top of the page, 1440. Just to sum up a little more of what we learned, just looking at it right now. So far, so good. Okay. Then he continued and said the following. Okay. So essentially, this means that the kav, what is its function? It's to illuminate, or I call radiate, let's say illuminate, and bring that divine consciousness into the existence, into that space. That's its role. What he calls illuminating the dark space, the cheshchas hatzimtzum, the darkness of the tzimtzum. And that's where Ikar Shmoy B'china Shechina, its primary name is Shechina, because of that, bringing down that energy into existence. And that will continue to evolve, the kav, that is, will continue to go down gradations, just like I said, a paintbrush. As you paint and shape existence, it goes down, gets diminished, all the way to the point that it will radiate, will reflect in the tzimtzum, what he called the tzimtzum of the Shechina, between the two rods of the holy ark in the temple, because that's where God spoke to Moses between that. So how is it possible? God fills the whole entire expanse of existence. So it says, we learned before, Tzimtzum Shechinte, the Shechina, so-called channeled itself to the sanctuary and specifically to the ark. And from there, it also manifests V'shachanti b'seicham, the divine presence manifesting in the heart and soul of every individual. B'seich kol echad ve'echad. Okay.
In Badei Ha'oroin, is the Shechina in a lower level than B'mokel? I think that in
it seems, because he says Yered Mishtalshel At Shemeir Ha'irase. So he says Yered Mishtalshel, yeah, because the Kav is completely a spiritual dimension all the way right after the Tzimtzum. The Mishkan, the temple, is already a physical sanctuary on earth. So it's definitely coming down. He says Yered Mishtalshel. That clearly it descends and evolves until it radiates its reflection between the Shnei Badei Ha'adam. But it's essentially coming from that same concept. That's where the Shechina basically that resides and dwells in the temple, the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan, originates from the Kav. That's essentially, the Kav allows for that Shechina to manifest. Or else, what would be the whole purpose of the sanctuary? God is everywhere. Here we want the godliness to be on our terms. So it has to be somewhat integrated. Because if without the Mishkan, God also exists everywhere. What was the purpose of building a temple? The purpose of building a temple is something on our terms, where God, so to speak, descends, so to speak, and communicates with us in a way that we can relate. That's the point. And that originates from the Kav. That's what he said. Yeah.
I thought that in Kodesh HaKodashim, it said, that's what I thought, that it is on her learners, even in Tanya, in the last Prokim, on Gimel, that in Kodesh HaKodashim, it is above everything, not through the Kav. That's what I thought. I don't know.
Well, here he says the opposite. It doesn't say that. Why? The Kav is, you think, a small little level. The Kav is the whole way. The only way the divine communicates with existence is through the Kav. Nothing can bypass the Kav. There is nothing that exists without the Kav. Without the Kav, all you have is a black hole, is a tzimtzum. So the Kav is essentially, remember, the Kav is not some outside force. It's divine communication. It's a divine laser beam, if you wish. Okay. V'nimtza. So now let's sum up the last piece we learned. So it says now, as I mentioned, this is all from the Rebbe Rashab, is quoting his father's Maimer, the Rebbe Marash, in V'kocha Tofresh Lamed Zayin, which is like the year 1877, and specifically chapter 27. So he continues now. He says, so Nimsa, what do we derive from this? That the primary name of the Kav should have actually been called Shechina. Why is it called Kav? Well, it should be Shechina. You just explained, because that's, if you want to really describe its personality, it's about dwelling, about residing. Kav simply means a line or a thread. So he explains the reason it's called Kav is only in order to teach us the manner, the Eifen, he says. Eifen Hamshacha, how it transmits. So that's why it's called Kav. It's telling us, how did God so-called channel the divine energy in a limited way? That's the Kav. Aber be'emes, he says, I'm reading, etzem hamshacha, aber be'emes. Yeah. The very core, if you want to describe what exactly is the transmission, not the manner of the transmission, you would call that Shechina, which means that Shechin, that it dwells, that it manifests, it dwells, it resides. Okay. To the point that it comes down into each soul, and even though the souls are distant from the Kav, nevertheless, a reflection of the Kav manifests in each soul. Okay. Now comes the next part, which is a little more. I'm going to break it down a bit further, and he's going to say Nava Oidya Shleimer. So here's important. If you look at the group, the Ayin Beis group, I posted yesterday. I'm just opening it up. If you look at the group, you'll see I posted the language from V'kocha. Because when you look there, you actually can understand what it says here. And I was confused by what the Rebbe Rashab said, but there he adds a few words. So if you look at the new paragraph on page 446, you see V'oidya Shleimer, Sheikara Kav B'Shem Shechina. So we're going to read, I'm just reading inside and I'll explain. Another reason the Kav is called Shechina. The first reason we understand, because Shechina means to manifest. The Kav manifests the divine on the terms of existence, meaning to radiate, to illuminate the darkness of the Tzimtzum. So he says, Eidya Shleimer Shenikra Kav B'Shem Shechina, Al Shem Shu HaMakabel Me'ein Sof U'Mashpia B'Netzolim. Another reason it's called Shechina is because it receives from the infinite divine light before the Tzimtzum. Because remember, the Kav is attached, even though it's Chazer V'Hoyer, which means there was a Hefsek, there was a pause, like a silence, and then it began to flow. But when it flows, it's connected to it, it's receiving from the Ein Sof, it's just channeling it. To use back to the example, when the teacher teaches even ABC, Aleph Beis, to a student, as much as it's diminished, it's still coming from the mind of the teacher. And the teacher knows that within those letters lie a lot of profound depth. Even though the child can be a preschool or kindergarten child and just hears Aleph, Beis, Gimel, but within it lies a lot of depth that the child will grow and the child's mind will expand and his knowledge will expand. He'll be able to realize that in this Aleph Beis lies depth. So it's all coming from the same teacher. The only thing is the teacher is not just allowing an unfettered and unbridled flow from his brilliant mind, he's channeling it into the words Aleph Beis. For example, the Friedrich Rebbe says that the Aleph of Anochi in the Ten Commandments, the entire Torah, the entire 10 Commandments are included in Aleph. In the word Anochi, the entire 10 Commandments are also in Anochi. The 10 Commandments include the entire Torah. So the bottom line is the entire Torah is all in an Aleph. But when you look at an Aleph, all you see is a letter. But it's like all letters. Letters are just containers. But within it lies tremendous amount of power. But you have to develop it. So basically, when what the Kav is doing is taking from Ein Sof, the infinite, and channeling it in a way that the receiver, the recipient, the student, the existence can receive it, but it's connected, so it's makabel from Ein Sof, and that's why it's called Shechina. And he says, like we discussed earlier about Ak. He said, "B'malchus of Ak receives from Ein Sof and mashpia b'netzolim." That's nikra b'chinas makabel. U'mishum zeh nikra Shechina. So let's read for a moment V'kocha to understand. So yesterday the question was, we asked, what's the difference between the first explanation and the second explanation? Why is it Oidya Shleimer? In the first explanation, you said the Kav comes to illuminate the dark space of the Tzimtzum. In the second interpretation, you say it's receiving from Ein Sof. So there's a line that he says in V'kocha. He says like this. Well, l'chem etzadei yesei mekabel nikra b'shem shchinta, k'may b'chinas hamalchus shenikra b'shem mekabel al shem shemekabelas b'chol esses fidas. For whatever reason, the Rebbe Rashab chose not to quote that line, but actually that line explains exactly what he's saying here. In other words, now Shechina for a different reason. First reason, Shechina, because it manifests into the structure, into the darkness of the Tzimtzum. Shechina has another meaning. It's a recipient. Malchus is a recipient from the 10 spheres above it, or the 9 spheres above it. Same thing here. The Kav is a recipient from Ein Sof. So we're not focusing now on illuminating the dark Tzimtzum, but rather that it's receiving, and Shechina also applies to the word recipient. That's what he says. So when you look at Ayin Beis, you can understand it, but he doesn't say that line. That line helps us understand what he's really trying to say here. Here he just says that same thing. But again, in V'kacha, he has that line. Being a makabel, it's called Shechina because it's like Malchus, which is called makabel. Why is it called a makabel? Because it receives from all the 10 spheres. Okay. So I think that makes it clear. I mean, I said it yesterday, really, because it was pretty obvious the meaning. But when you look in the V'kacha, it's very, very clear what the meaning is. So basically, 2 things about the Kav. One is that it manifests, Shechina from the word manifesting and in clothing itself in the garments of the recipient, or in this case, the cheshka, the darkness of the tzimtzum. The second, the Eid Yeshlem, is that it receives from a higher level. Okay. Now, here's where the Rebbe Rashab adds a third reason that his father, the Rebbe Marash, did not write. He says, V'gam, there's another reason, is what we learned earlier, that the head of the Kav, something else happens here. There's a third thing that happens. The Kav becomes atik. The Kav, let's see here, V'gam commissions both the Reish Kav nasa atik la'ak. So just like Malchus of Atzilus becomes Atik of Bria, let's explain what that means. In general speaking, the rule is in the cosmic order, and in general a structure. The lower level of a higher level always becomes the head of the next level. It's like if you have two levels of a hierarchy. The first level is a class of a higher class. So the lowest person in the higher class will become the teacher of the next class, of the lower class. So Malchus of every world becomes the Keser or Atik, which is the higher level of the next world. So the same thing is with the Kav. The Kav, besides the first 2 things we just said, that it illuminates the darkness, the second thing that the Kav does is it's receiving from the infinite light. Another thing, it becomes so-called the Atik, the leader, if you wish, of the lower level. And as such, so he continues, it says, that's why it's called Shechina, because its reflection resides in Bria. Now, you could ask, so how is this different than the first interpretation? This third interpretation seems to be like the same one as earlier. So the obvious difference is that here he's saying not that it's radiating and illuminating the darkness, it's that it's illuminating the world of Bria. It's actually becoming a teacher of Bria. When you say that the Kav shines within the dark hole or the black hole of the Tzimtzum, you're not yet speaking about recipients. There are no recipients yet. You're saying that in general, the Kav begins by illuminating. Before there was a silence, the teacher now begins to communicate. Now you're saying in this third interpretation, doesn't just communicate, it actually becomes an active teacher, an ongoing communicator to the lower levels. And that's what he's going to explain next, what the difference is between these 3 reasons. So let's continue summing it up. Now, again, I pointed out this third reason is not cited in V'kacha, in the Rebbe Marash's Maimer. You following? Okay, good. I will try to explain briefly after we sum it up what the significance of all these 3 points are. It's not just theoretical abstractions. It really has a difference in how you communicate and how you draw down energy. Like, in a way you could even say this is the art of communication. And you'll see in a moment how each one of these 3 things plays a different role. But I want to first continue what he said next. And now I understand why he adds the parentheses. The parentheses coming to add that we're not just talking about the Kav illuminating the dark lightness of the tzimtzum. That's the idea of illumination. That's like the first thing the kav does. It shines light. But we're talking about how the kav engages with and becomes atik of bria. The kav could just have illuminated the darkness of the tzimtzum and doesn't necessarily become atik, the kesed of bria. The fact that we say it does, it means the kav is now associating with the next level. That's why in the parentheses he says that when atik becomes atik to bria, it's hashpa b'kiruv. Because the first thing of the kav, that is Shechina, because it illuminates darkness, doesn't necessarily mean it's in a form of kiruv. That is close. But when it becomes atik, it's in a form of kiruv, and that's why it brings pleasure to the souls in Gan Eden Elyon, and that's why it's called ban hayered lamata. So it's much deeper. It would be basically the difference if the teacher was just sharing some thoughts, or is the teacher engaging with the student in a very internal way. That's what reason number three adds. So the same thing with the kav, who b'chinas atik legaba akshenik adam debriya, and that in turn draws the reflection down into biyah haklolim, which is the macrocosmic bria tzirasira, ak, akudim, and atzilus, and that's the third aspect of the kav. Now comes what's the difference between them? V'hefresh ben gimel taimim hanal. And here again, quite fascinating. In V'kocha, he says the hefresh between two reasons. In Ayin Beis, he says the difference between three reasons because he added a third reason that the Rebbe Rashab did not add. And I have some thoughts on that too. We'll share that in a moment. Let me just first, what is the difference? According to the first reason, he says, I'm comparing it to the language in V'kocha. So he says like this. I'm reading inside. L'tama aleph hariyakav bereishis amshachah shenikra b'shem Shechina liyeh sheklolos inyonu l'hoyer escheshkos atzimtzum. According to the first reason, the kav, right when it begins to shine or begins to transmit, it's called Shechina because its general function or role is to radiate the darkness of the tzimtzum. It's something like when you say in the beginning of the Torah, it says the world was covered in darkness. Right in the beginning of Bereshis. And then it says, Vayemer lekim yehi or, vayehi or. So it says, it's what it says, the earth was completely void or chaotic. Darkness filled all of existence. And then God said, let there be light. So we're not getting into the details of how the light affects anything. It's just the fact is, the concept of light. What does that mean in, let's call it in psychological terms? We could live in a world that we could be shrouded in darkness and ignorance. And there's no concept of ever getting clarity. You know, sometimes you meet people that they live in a dark state and that's it. The very concept that you allow clarity into your life, we're not even getting into the details, is already a tremendous achievement. So the kav is basically coming to counter. You needed the darkness, you needed the tzimtzum in order to leave space for an independent consciousness. But we want to also have clarity, or else you can't transform this world. If we only had darkness, and we would never be able to find direction or guidance. So the first thing the kav does is introduces the concept of clarity. That's the first reason. It's called Shechina. The other two reasons, he says, now he's talking about after we've established that now there's dark and there's light. That's what the kav does. Then the two other reasons come to explain, once the kav has already established light, now what happens? After it's already transmitted, not just its initial transmission. And here too, we have two reasons it's called Shechina. One, because it is receiving, it's a makabel from Eir Ein Sof. In other words, it's like a channel that is reaching upward. And this third reason is because the kav actually engages with existence. It will become the atik of bria. It won't remain aloof and removed. It will become involved in. Which, interestingly, the reason 2 and 3 adds a whole other dimension. It's not just the kav is bringing the concept of light. It creates a channel that connects Eir Ein Sof before the tzimtzum and brings it down into into existence. That's the reasons. So 2 and 3 cover what happens afterwards. And reason one is talking about its initial presence. Let's just look at V'kacha. That's how he says it, and then I'll explain what this is, what this means. So V'kacha, he says like this. Okay. So V'kacha, I'm just reading from V'kacha because it can help. He says, Omnam be'emes inyan zeh inyan zeh shemetam zeh yikar Shechina yitakim gam lefi pirush harishon. He's saying this idea that the kav is called Shechina because it's a makabel, like Malchus receives. The truth is, it's also consistent, Yitakin, also according to the first interpretation, that the kav is coming to radiate or illuminate the darkness of the tzimtzum. Ela shehefresh b'neihem. That's how he structures it. The difference between the two reasons is, according to the Shalafi Pirush Harishon, B'reishis hamshachas hakav nikra b'shem Shechina li yesei b'kavonas hamshachas b'shvil lahoyer b'teich sheiches hatzimtzum ha'mokem poneh. Exactly like he said here in Ayin Beis. The first reason it's called Shechina is in order to tell us what its initial purpose is, to illuminate the darkness. Well, if you Pirush Hasheni, remember V'kachi only brings a second reason, Hainu acher shekvar nimshech. Exactly the same words. The Rebbe Rashab adds that there's also the third reason is kvar shekvar nimshech. Okay, so we have three reasons, and then he concludes like this, what we learned yesterday. The eich sheyiyeh mikol ha'taimim. However you explain it, all three reasons, one thing is clear, move on, that the kav is called Shechina. There's just three reasons why it's called Shechina, but it's called Shechina. Both in its initial transmission and its extended transmission. And what then is called Kutche Brichu? Remember, we talked, there's also the transcendent. This is the kav as it's manifesting. What's Kutche Brichu? That's Erein Sof Shalifnei Tzimtzum Shu B'chinas Ha'igul HaGadol. This is the infinite divine light pre-Tzimtzum, which is the level of the Igul HaGadol that precedes the kav. That's Kutche Brichu, because we're talking about the infinite divine light. The teacher, before the Tzimtzum, is removed from the student. That's why it's called HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kadosh Baruch Hu refers to Kadosh Umuvdal, that it's holy and removed. So now you have the two levels, the kav being the Shechina for three different reasons, and Kutche Brichu being the divine energy preceding the kav. Basically, in the example, the teacher, before he concealed all his brilliance, the kav is after he concealed it and channels it. As we said, the three aspects of it. One, to radiate the dark space, the empty space, to illuminate that. Two, to connect and draw down from the infinite. And three, to connect itself and engage with Bria and the lower worlds. Okay. So let me just add, this is where we stopped yesterday. So let me just add a few things here. First of all, let's talk about the Igul HaGadol. So the Igul HaGadol, for those that are not familiar with the concept, I described it yesterday briefly, but I'll just elaborate a bit more. I mean, everything here is spiritual and therefore all abstract. There's no physical circle and there's no physical kav. But we have to speak the language of man, and our language is physical. So we use it like a metaphorical language. Like I give the example, when the teacher's brilliant mind is like the Erein Sof. So obviously, there's no physical, we're talking about just intelligence that is unlimited. The Tzimtzum is the teacher concealing that, which really means the teacher is only withholding it, like the restraint of the teacher to allow space for another. That's called Tzimtzum. Then when the Tzimtzum happens, automatically an Igul HaGadol is created. What's the Igul HaGadol? Igul HaGadol is when the teacher is restraining the flow of his intelligence. There's a student sitting near him, and he's not saying anything because he wants the student to have space. The student should not be overwhelmed by all this infinite knowledge, right? So what happens with the brilliance? What happens with all his intelligence? We know the teacher doesn't suddenly lose it. He has all that brilliance in his mind. He knows it. He's aware of it. He's just not speaking it. In other words, he's leaving space for another, but he's not changed. So the way Kabbalah, the way the Arizal says when he describes the Tzimtzum, that light receded. So in physical terms, it would be like, think of something, let's say, the water, an ocean that completely covers the ocean bed. But then the ocean recedes. What would happen? So now you have a space in the middle where it's dry, but all around it, the water is there. In this case, the light remains, but it remains like a halo that's not entering that space. It's leaving room. I gave the example of the solar eclipse. When you look at a full solar eclipse, you see a black disk. The moon is blocking the sun, but you see a halo. The Igul HaGadol is like that halo. Obviously, it's not physical, but conceptually, what it means that it remains makif, like an igul. It remains removed because it's no longer in the center because the center space was created. And you've restrained yourself, you've withheld, but nevertheless, the light is still there. So it's called that Igul HaGadol, meaning like a big circle that's makif, that surrounds that black hole in the middle. That's what it means. Conceptually, I said not physical, conceptually, that is the idea of the Igul HaGadol. So the Igul HaGadol is really is still a part of the Ein Sof that was there before, but now it's only in its own space. It's not affecting the space of the student or the space of existence as we're describing it. So he says that's the level of Kudsha Brichu. Just for the record, and I mentioned it yesterday, when you look up in Samach Vav and other places where it talks about the Igul HaGadol, it says the Igul HaGadol is still affected by the Tzimtzum, but there are levels of Ein Sof that are not even affected by that altogether. Because the Igul HaGadol means it's a light that's receded. What about the light within the teacher that doesn't even recede? That's never been affected in the first place because it was never in that realm altogether. But that we're not discussing here. That's even higher levels. You wouldn't even call that Kudsha Brichu because that's not even removed. That's completely beyond this entire realm. Here we're talking about two states. One where the divine that manifests, the Kav, and the divine that is so-called stands above or removed somewhat in a more transcendent state. And that's the Kudsha Brichu and Shechina. That's regarding the Igul HaGadol. The thing I wanted to add to make things a little more palpable or palatable is the three interpretations. Now that we read it again, I think it becomes a lot clearer that what he's really coming to say is that, remember, the whole theme of Ayin Beis, of Chassidus in general, of Torah in general, is to create an interface between the divine and existence. And that's a problem because ostensibly, God is as diametric opposite of existence in every possible way. Not just infinite and finite, creator and creation, immortal and mortal. I mean, when you really start understanding the divine, it's what we call, Chassidus uses the quote expression, Bilta Metzias Nimtza, and non-existential existence. You can't even define God in the terms of saying he exists. Because for us, existence means something that we can relate to, something that either with our sensory tools, our suprasensory tools. When you say God exists, it's not how this table exists because I see it or because it was placed here. God doesn't exist because he occupies any type of parameters. He exists because he's just the reality, period. Reality exists. So he's talking about an entity like God in his full glory, nothing in common with existence. Besides the fact creator and creation. Remember, God is even beyond being a creator. And yet, this God said that he wants to have a relationship with us. So how do you create a relationship between two opposites? Completely opposite in every possible way. So that's why the Torah explains, and that's where Kabbalah and Chassidus come and say God created a whole cosmic order, what we call Seder Shtalshlus. Essentially, a stepping stones that allow us to relate to God, to understand how God relates to us, and allows us to retrace the steps, essentially like a ladder. And this ladder is a step-by-step process. That's why everything in life is a process. God could have made that that a child doesn't have to go, a newborn doesn't have to go through 9 months of pregnancy. It should take a second. But we don't see that. Everything in existence goes through a growth process. 9 months of pregnancy, then the baby is born, and then the baby starts growing day by day, year by year. Its mind grows, its emotions grow. Everything in existence is a growth process. So God didn't have to do it that way, but he wanted a relationship with us. So he wanted it to make sense. Now you could say he could have made it a different way that would have also made sense. That we'll never understand. But this is the way, the logic that God created. But now we can understand the relationship, even between a teacher and a student can be infinitely apart. But like we're speaking, there's a tzimtzum. So the teacher can conceal, starts teaching Aleph Beis, and over time, the student can surpass the teacher. There's the expression that 40 years, a student begins to appreciate with their teacher's depth, the depth of the teacher. Why? Because the students, step by step, has expanded their containers, has expanded their consciousness to the point that you can receive much higher and greater energy, to the point that you can literally become like one with your teacher. The same idea. God said, I want a relationship with you. Yes, it's not overnight. Begin step by step. We say every day, for example, V'haftas Hashem Elokecha, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. Love God with all your soul, with all your spirit, b'chol levavcha rather, with all your heart, b'chol nefesh, with all your soul, and b'chol meidecha, with all your might. What's the difference between the three? So we've learned earlier that essentially one is with your emotionally, one is with all your being, all your faculties, and then ultimately even with that which is beyond, you go even beyond yourself. The point being is you cannot leap. Every process has to go step by step. You can't climb a ladder from the bottom to the top without rung by rung. Sometimes you can jump 2 rungs. Sometimes you can jump a few rungs. But generally speaking, for it to be an integrated experience, it's going to be a step-by-step process. There are no shortcuts and there's no magic tricks. So essentially what Chassidus says and what Chassidus teaches, and this is the essence of whole Ayin Beis, the interface. But to understand an interface like this, you could imagine how many steps there are. That's why we're already on page 1,440 pages, just Ayin Beis. I mean, even look at regular circuitry. Look at your smartphone. Look at any technology. How many interfaces are going on when you press a button? How many things is it triggering? And that's a simple physical item, which we can't say is infinite and finite. And yet, it opens up an electrical circuit, which opens another circuit. Or look in the human body. You take a piece of food into your mouth. How many steps does it go through till it becomes the nutrients in your bloodstream? It has to first be broken down, and then it has to be expel the waste, and then it continues to be digested and all of that. And then finally, it becomes the part of our blood, flesh and blood. So everything is a process. The same thing is the process of the connection between us and the divine. So therefore, in that context, when he's discussing now the Kav as the ultimate interface, because it's the first step with the divine, or the teacher, the divine teacher, if you wish, the cosmic teacher, is beginning to communicate. So understanding the 3 reasons actually enrich the experience. It's not just the Kav is coming and shining. It's applying itself to the student, which is the 3rd reason. The first reason is that it illuminates the darkness. The second reason is that it's connected to the source. That means you have access to the Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. Because if it's going to be a true interface, it has to not be compromised anything. You want God to be represented. You want the student to be represented, or existence to be represented, and you want the in-between. So my understanding of why he's really breaking it down to 3 is to show how the Kav has all 3 elements. Like, when you have a translator, someone's translating, let's say, between Hebrew and English. If he knows Hebrew very well and he doesn't know English very well, it's going to be a very compromised translation. If he knows English very well and doesn't know Hebrew very well, same problem. You need someone who's a perfect interface, seamless. He knows the original language well, he knows the destination language well, and he knows how to bring them together. He knows how to translate well. That's the ultimate interface. So God on his own is completely beyond us. We are a different type of reality. The interface has to have, a real mamutza has to have something from the divine and something from existence. So Kav is doing exactly that. And perhaps the 3 reasons, each one reflects a different aspect. The first reason is just the general Kav creating the bridge. The second reason is that it's drawing from Ein Sof, so you have the divine in its full integrity, channeled, but still it's connecting, it's receiving from Ein Sof. And the third reason is that it's engaging with the student. It's not aloof, and it's not from the top down. that the Kav becomes Atik of Bria and Yetzirah and Asiya, and from there to the Biyah Klolim, to the macrocosmic worlds, and from there throughout all of existence, all the way. So when we say V'shachanti b'seicham, that God said, build for me a sanctuary and I will dwell among you in an integrated, internalized way, now we understand how that's possible. Because this God himself is beyond us. How can God be internal within you and within me? The answer is because there's a Kav, and the Kav creates that channel. The channel that, first of all, bridges the two, draws from Eir and Sof, because you say the divine manifests in the Shechina, not in a compromised way. Tzimtzum Shechinte ben Shnei Badei Aron. And the Shechina resides in each one of us. And at the same time, the Kav is also causing the energy to flow in a way that relates to us. Like a teacher is applying himself and engaging, like you said, the third reason. So with that, we understand somewhat what the Kav's role is. And at the end of the conclusion is, regardless of the reason, the Kav is called Shechina. And Eir Ein Sof, before the Tzimtzum, that's called, the Igul HaGadol, that's called Kutche Brichu. Now, what still needs to be explained, how do you bring these two together? Yichud, that's what he's going to speak about soon. The Avodah, that's our work, is to connect the transcendent divine, because this is what God put into place. The Kav is not created by us. That was created by the teacher. But now comes our work. After we have heard the ABC or Aleph Beis, and the transmission is flowing, now we have work to do, which is to expand our containers through our refining ourselves, dealing with sublimating and taming our animal soul, and everything we do in our tzimtzum, that we allow the tzimtzum to be transformed, as we learned much earlier at length, to transform the darkness of our lives into a channel for the light of the Kav, and the Kav continues to expand, and it leads us all the way back to the Igul HaGadol, to Eir Ein Sof, before the tzimtzum, and even higher, in there itself, many levels higher that we'll soon learn about as well. What we have here now, the Kav becomes the primary place where Shechina, where the Shechina, so-called, is defined by the Shechina. So this doesn't contradict what we learned earlier, that Kutche Bricha and Shechina exists in Atzilus, in Keser, in Ak, all the different levels I mentioned before, because the fact is, on a microcosmic level, the interfaces are everywhere. It's not just another Kav. You need it in every part, every stop, every so-called stop throughout the whole cosmic order. You always need this interface to interact with each other to create this, the channels. Because remember, in an assembly line, if you have one weak link, it breaks the circuit. So you need to have Shtalshlus means from the word chain, a link in a chain. Every link needs to be intact. So every link needs to be linked to the previous link. So the interface is everywhere. So Kutche Bricha and Shechina is on all levels. But in a primary way, the Kav here now has come to the point where that becomes like the first real manifestation of Shechina in its fullest sense of the word, based on these explanations that he just gave here. Okay. So that was a mouthful. Since it needs a lot of explanation, yesterday it was very dense and concentrated, so that's somewhat of elaboration. But I see it's already, I went pretty long here. If anybody wants to ask anything, I was going to continue reading, but we'll see if we have time. So let's see if there's any questions. You're entitled to ask also. I have, for the record, I have a good friend that came to visit. He's sitting actually in the class right here with me. Should I say his name? Yeah. Peter Himmelman. You may have heard his name. We talked about him. We talk about you all the time. Yeah. Behind your back. So he's sitting here
Welcome. Wow. Yeah. That's wonderful.
Yeah. So everyone's saying hello to you. Yeah.
Rabbi.
Space?
Oh, sure.
Okay, he'll say hello shortly. Any questions?
Not to belabor this point about the Tzimtzum, but is there a Kutche Brichu and Shechina within the Tzimtzum, or is that doesn't apply to that specific area or subject?
He doesn't bring it here, and that's that. The Tzimtzum means is a concealment. Kutche Bricha and Shechina are both revelation. Kutche Bricha is a divine transcendent revelation above, and Shechina manifests. So it wouldn't make sense that the Tzimtzum would be called Shechina. Shechina means a manifestation. Something is dwelling there. The Kav makes total sense because the Kav is a revelation. So it wouldn't, And in addition to the fact he doesn't even mention that, so I would say there's no that we don't say that. Whether on some subtle level you can find within the Tzimtzum the Rishimu, we know there's that trace, the Rishimu that exists, but he's not talking about that here, so I wouldn't go there.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
The Kav, it's apparent that it's not a static condition.
Right.
In some sense, it was like the Kav was created, it did its thing, but it's the continuous creation. It's constantly, this interface is alive in some sense, continuously. Is that?
Yeah, that's what he's saying essentially. It would be like the idea where a brilliant teacher could also choose not to interact with his students. He could just choose to sit in his room and leave me alone. The Kav is saying, no, I am interacting.
Okay.
But it could be a one-time interaction.
Right.
Like, and that's it. The Kav is like, let's call it electricity has to flow all the time. You can't just have a one-time surge. It has to be a continuous flow. Basically, when we say that the divine is breathing or speaking all the time and energy flowing, that's the Kav, is that conduit. It's the artery that's bringing. It's like the main artery from the heart that's continuously pumping. Now, the Kav, when we do our avodah, when we do our proper work, we refine ourselves and align ourselves like a healthy body. It'll be pumping more energy. You'll have even more blood, so to speak, which we'll talk about later. Right now, he's not getting there. Right now, he's just talking about his basically more the building blocks. Yeah, that's correct. Any other questions? So let me just see if I should continue on here. Let me just see. I don't want to just read a line and then stop. Yeah, I'm going to stop here because the next section, he's going to move even further up. We're going to start moving now into the Eir Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum itself. We're going to also learn their levels. And we've already learned that in the past. Remember, before the Tzimtzum, then we're talking about purely divine consciousness. It is already an energy allowing existence to emerge. It's already the Big Bang has happened, so to speak. Pre-Tzimtzum is pre-Big Bang, meaning there it's all within the divine God envisioning existence. So we're going to learn about that. He's going to slowly move further up. So it's really a fascinating, yeah. So I'm going to stop here. Any other questions? So let's consider this somewhat of a more elaborate overview or review of what we learned till here, page 1440. I also found it fascinating that the Rebbe Rashab is adding to his father, the Rebbe Marash. I was wondering like why the Rebbe Marash didn't bring this third reason. So I can't, it's speculation, but what I was thinking was, and I'll share with you, generally the Rabbeim, all the Chassidus of each Rebbe is built upon the previous one. Like even this whole piece I mentioned before is all built on a Maimer set Simchas Torah, Tovkuf Samachei, which would be the equivalent of 1804 by the Alter Rebbe, as was written down by his son, the Mittler Rebbe. And each Rebbe added to it. It's a Maimer Havayli Be'bira Havayli Be'ezri. So each Rebbe would add and build upon. Now, why did they add? Besides the fact that they added explanation, you could also say as the generations continue to go, we need to integrate it more. Like when the Rebbe says that this is the 7th generation from the Alter Rebbe, basically saying that we're building upon, like a midget that stands on the shoulders of giants, we're building upon those that came before us, and we're expanding it, and we're bringing it into more detail. So it could be the third reason that the Rebbe Rashab was all about more engagement. That's what the third reason is. That the Kav doesn't just shine, doesn't just illuminate, and doesn't just receive from above, but it becomes Atik. It actually becomes part of. It's like the teacher doesn't just teach the class; he becomes part of the class. So it could be that this is like a deeper form of what we call pnimius. And as the generations go, we connect even more with the divine. In other words, not just the divine as it's somewhat above us, but it's actually, the Kav is actually manifesting within us in a permanent fashion. So that essentially the Atik of Bria is, the Kav is becoming the Atik of Bria. The Rebbe explains, for example, Rosh Hashanah, an interesting, Rosh Hashanah, we say about the 10 days of Tshuva. Aser Simei Tshuva, the Gemara is, the language in Gemara is Asara Yomim Sheben Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippur. The 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But if you count it, there are only 7 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. 10 days, if you count the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's 10 days. So why does the Gemara say 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? And a fascinating answer. It says, because Rosh Hashanah has two aspects to it. One is it's a unique holiday. It's the head of the year. Blow shofar. It's separate from the 10 days. But it's also, you count them in the 10 days because it's the first day of Tishrei. Yom Kippur is the 10th day of Tishrei because Rosh Hashanah is the first day. In other words, you don't start counting the month of the regular days of the month from day 3. You start counting. So Rosh Hashanah has two aspects to it. One, it's a head, removed from the rest of the days, but it's also part of the head of the body is unique, that is the central nervous system, but it also is the part of the body. So there's an integration between so-called what makes it removed and what makes it part of. So essentially, you could say this, and same thing with Yom Kippur. That's why you say 10 days between, because there's two things. There's the 7 days, if you're talking technically. But since Rosh Hashanah is also one of the 10 days, as being part of that body of 10 days, you say it's 10 days between the head of Rosh Hashanah and the other head called Yom Kippur. So similarly, you can say the same thing here. You could have the Kav is teaching, but it's like Mamay Lamata, like someone standing on a pedestal and teaching you. It's a very different story if he engages with you. He comes down on your level. So the teacher isn't just remaining above, but he's actually engaging with. So that's what the Rebbe Rashab's third reason is talking about deeper engagement. I'll just add one more thing. I remember once, beautiful sikha the Rebbe spoke about, there's a halacha that if, the Ir Miklat was those cities of refuge. Somebody accidentally killed someone. So in the time of the temple, they could escape to a city of refuge. There's a whole discussion of what exactly that entails. But it was considered a golus. It means you were displaced, you were exiled, you couldn't leave that city. And when you were in that city, you were protected. They couldn't come do anything. There was no, the family could not exact vengeance on you. Okay, so there's an interesting halacha. It says if a Talmud, a student, ends up in a city of refuge, it says Maglin Rabba Imay. His teacher goes with him. Because the teacher is so bound with the student, he doesn't remain removed. The student is suffering, the teacher suffers with him. So you could have a teacher that's removed, and he teaches, but I'm not in part of your life. You got your problems, it's your problems. I'm not involved in your problems. Or you have a teacher that is completely intimately connected. This is how I'm understanding the third level here. That's a much deeper connection. Reminds me of the story when the Mittler Rebbe was once the Yechidus. People were coming to see a private audience. So he had a long line of people who were waiting to see him for advice, for blessings. Anyway, and suddenly in middle, he tells his secretary, his gabbai, his assistant, that he has to stop the Yechidus, which was uncharacteristic. There were a lot of people waiting. It was after the holidays, I believe, so they were waiting. They were going to go home afterwards. But he stopped. It was strange, but that's what he did. The gabbai, but from behind the door, he hears how the Mittler Rebbe is crying, and you could see he was in very deep anguish over something. Anyway, time passed, and finally the Mittler Rebbe resumed, and people came to see. So later, either he asked or the Mittler Rebbe told him, like, what happened? Why would the Mittler Rebbe stop receiving an audience? So the Mittler Rebbe said this. I find this to be one of the most powerful stories. He said, when people come to me for advice, I have to find the problem they have within me somewhere. Even if it's something that I didn't do, but somewhere, some subtle, because I can't really advise them if I can't fix it within myself. And once I find it within myself, I correct it, and then I can advise them what to do. There was one person who came to see me. He said something which was so painful and so out of off the reservation, that I couldn't find, even in a subtle way, I couldn't find it within myself. But it's hashgacha pratis. If God sent them to me, it means that I must have something. And I just couldn't. So I couldn't continue to give him advice. So I had to pray and literally do tshuva in some way to find out what that thing is. Then I found what it may be within me. And then I was able to give him advice, and then I was able to continue. You talk about bedside manner. Most therapists see themselves as detached from their clients, and they should be. We don't need transference and counter-transference. But then there's another side called empathy, where you really identify with the person. Not because you're them, but because you're not some detached. There's a real connection going on. We say the Shechina, we talked about Golu Imam, Golu Le'edem Shechina Imam. Interesting, the word Shechina is used. That when the Jews went to exile, it says God, the Shechina went with them. Shechina. Doesn't say Kutchabrichu, because there's a part of the divine, obviously, is removed from it all. But the Shechina goes with them, because there's an element that God is Imei Anechi B'tzara. He's with us in our pain. That's why it says Erdana. God said, let's descend and see where the painful cries of Sodom are coming from. Why did he have to descend? God didn't know where it's coming from. God is everywhere. But there's a certain element, can the divine engage with us on our terms? Or does he remain aloof and remain beyond and so on? So perhaps this third level that he's explaining really takes Shechina to a whole nother dimension, that it's not just manifesting and it's not just receiving from Eir Ein Sof or the second reason, or the first reason and the second reason, but the third reason that actually becomes part of existence and becomes part of Atik of Bria. Just a little more elaboration on that. Okay. So we'll stop here. Review middle of the new